Hello again, I'm Paula Gooder in conversation with Rowan Williams about his book Discovering Christianity. Today we're looking at the third chapter, What is Theology? Rowan, theology. Sounds like a big and scary word, doesn't it?
It does.
As soon as you say the word theology, I can feel people going, no, but that's not for me, really genuinely not for me. What do you think theology is?
Theology is thinking intelligently about who you are as a believer and what kind of world you live in as a believer. It's not trying to pin God down like a skewered butterfly on a board and just examine something mysterious and reduce it in that way. It's thinking about the landscape you've entered, the difference that belief is making to how you understand both God and yourself and other people. And so, like faith itself, it's an exploratory business. It increasingly, over the centuries, refines or, I wouldn't say narrows down, but makes a little bit more precise the kind of language we might use. It warns us off some kind of murky areas where we might make some really serious mistakes. But when it's doing its job, it ought to be exhilarating. It ought to be something that gives us a sense of the largeness of what we've been brought into. So I would say theology begins in what I'll call intelligent thanksgiving. Something's happened for which I'm grateful. Let's put my mind to work on what its implications are.
And in the book, you talk about Peter as being somebody who does some of the first theology on the day of Pentecost. And I kind of rather love that idea. He's had an experience and now he's trying to put some words around it. Why do you think he chose the words that he did when he was doing his first bit of theology?
Peter and the other disciples have just had their first real sort of head-on experience of the Holy Spirit. They've discovered they can connect with one another in a new way and they can communicate at a new level, which is represented in the story by the gift of languages. They're communicating at a different level. Some barriers broken down. So Peter stands up and he reaches for the imagery in his tradition. He reaches for the Jewish language that he's grown up with, that is his own language. And he says, you know what? This is a bit like what we read about in the prophecy of Joel, that one day the Spirit of God would be poured out on the whole earth and the barriers would be broken down between people. Now, says Peter to the crowd, that's like what we've been experiencing today. So let's make the connection. Something in what's there in our tradition as Jews has come alive in a new way here. So let's look for some other clues and some other echoes. Peter begins to make connections. He begins to say, well, this reminds me of that, and this could be another version of that, and maybe this is what that is pointing to. And so you're on the way then to doing theology, in that the experience is being more fully connected with what we inherit, with the language we share. It's shown to be something that deepens and enlarges what we already share, and that's partly what I mean by theology.
Yes. And I think I'm really struck by you saying that Peter used language that he already knew to make sense of what's going on. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of people struggle with theology today is that it's using other people's language for something that we recognise, but it's not really the language that we would use. What would you say in reflection on theology as us trying to find the words? How can we find words that actually make sense to us today?
Not at all easy, is it? And some of the greatest theologians of the last century or so have really underlined the difficulty of finding words that, to borrow the phrase of one very great theologian, words that change things in the way that that the words of the New Testament change things. Two things, then. One is perhaps we do need to be a little bit more reticent at times in our language to understand that the technical words we might want to use won't necessarily land with people. And just to say, well, we think we know what we're doing, and we'll carry on praying and worshipping as we have. We will take our time with the language and see how that lands and how that connects. We won't assume too much, and we won't be overconfident in the words we use. That doesn't mean that the words aren't true or the concepts don't matter, but that just as a matter of ordinary pastoral common sense, we won't push too much technicality at people. The other side of it, though, is what do we reach for if we do want to make sense? And sometimes it seems to me we need, as believers, to have quite a robust awareness of the world, the imaginative world we live in, to use the experience of the arts, of poetry and fiction and drama, and draw those in as best we can to make some sense of the basics we're trying to communicate. In some way, people have always done that. And when you look at the history of Christian communication in historically non-Christian cultures, you'll often find a period where people really don't quite know what to reach for because they don't quite know yet what the depths and the resources are of the culture they've moved into. Watch the way in which Catholic missionaries in China in the 17th century feel their way into using some classical Chinese philosophical and even religious concepts to fill out and body out what they're talking about. I think we're still in that position, really, only we don't have the kind of sophisticated religious and philosophical tradition that lots of people share, which might have been the case in 17th century China. We do have a richly imaginative world still with a lot of resources that can be drawn on. So no short answer to that.
And it's probably worth acknowledging, isn't it, that when we are talking of God, we are using language for a being that can't be put into language, and being a little bit relaxed with that.
That's exactly where we are, I think. We don't have God simply sitting there as an object we can walk around. And to use a very old image, a fish is in a very bad position to look at the sea. And so we are in a very bad position to look at God from a distance. Yeah. A fish might, using our imagination, but a fish might be able to talk about swimming. And perhaps theology is a bit more like talking about swimming. Well, this is where we are, how we're feeling our way. This is what we think our world must be like. And for us, how our God must be, if this is what it's like being human in this world. So perhaps, a fish in the water.
And there is a tradition, isn't there, of simply lapsing into silence, recognising all those things that we can't know about God or can't articulate about God.
That's right, and the tradition tells us not to panic about that. So you've used your mind and your imagination about as fully as you can, and you still haven't got there. Don't panic. There's always more to discover, and what's on the far side of that kind of frustration or lack of understanding is not that there's nothing to understand, but that there is more to understand than your mind could ever cope with. Yes. And back to fish and sea again, getting out of your depth is part of it. And if that means silence, so be it. And if the silence means that you are being really receptive and attentive to the mystery, if you're holding yourself in silence just so that the action of God can come in more fully and more freely, well, that's what a lot of people understand by the heart of prayer, of course. And without that prayerful awareness in the centre of things, your theology is going to be a bit tinny.
Yeah. And I'm really interested that you've brought prayer in, because often when we talk about theology, we think about it as a clean, pure academic discipline, and we just use our brains. But I would certainly resonate that the beating heart of theology is prayer.
It has to be. It has to be. Because otherwise, why bother, frankly? Prayer is the deepest expression we have of the relationship created by all the stuff we're talking about in theology. And if that relationship hasn't been created and isn't alive, well, there's not a great deal of point in doing theology at all, is there?
Rowan, thank you. Today, we've been talking about what theology is. Join us next time when we turn our attention to the church.